Fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist ideology and political system that emerged in the early 20th century, most notably in Italy under Benito Mussolini and in Germany under Adolf Hitler. In this video, we will cover Italy first and then Germany in the second part. During 1893 to 1894, the peasants who rose against their landlords in Sicily called themselves Fasci Siciliani. Fascism advocates for a centralized dictatorial government, extreme nationalism, and the suppression of political dissent, often with the focus of militarism and violence. Fascism rejects democracy and promotes the idea that the state is supreme over individual rights. It is pretty hard to put fascism in a dictionary definition. Robert Paxton, in his book The Anatomy of Fascism, says that the fascism in power is a compound, a powerful amalgam of different but marriageable conservative, national socialist, and radical right ingredients bonded together by common enemies and common passions for a regenerated, energized, and purified nation at whatever cost to free institutions and the rule of law. The precise proportion of the mixture are the result of processes, choices, alliances, compromises, rivalries. Fascism in action looks much more like a network of relationships than a fixed essence. Now, people often relate fascism to capitalism or sometimes to socialism. Let me be clear before we move further. Fascism is not capitalism or socialism, although some of the industrialists and landowners were backing and providing financial aid to Mussolini and Hitler, and they ran their campaign on socialist ideology, but it was an authoritarian regime. Mussolini and Hitler, they both had alliances with the corporations, but they were not capitalists in the sense of supporting free market economy. In the manifesto of the fascism, Mussolini outlined the economic principles of fascism, which rejected the laissez-faire capitalist model in favor of corporatism, a system where the state actively intervened in the economy. Under this model, state-controlled corporations would represent both workers and employers, negotiating wages, working conditions, and production quotas. On the other hand, both fascism and socialism involve significant state involvement in the economy, but they differ fundamentally in their ideological foundations, approaches to governance, economic control mechanism, views on class relations, and historical contexts. Fascism emphasizes nationalism and authoritarian control with regulated capitalism, while socialism seeks egalitarianism through collective ownership and democratic governance aimed at reducing inequalities. These distinctions highlight the contrasting visions each ideology presents for organizing society and its economic structure. It was Sunday morning of March 23, 1919 in Milan, in a meeting room of an industrial and commercial alliance overlooking Piazza San Sepolcro. More than 100 men, including war veterans, recruiters and intellectuals gathered with the intentions of declaring war against the enemy of nationalism ideology, which is socialism. Mussolini called his movement the Fasci di Combattimento, which means fraternities of combat. He adopted the ancient Roman fascist as his symbol. This was a bundle of rods tied around an axe, which represented the power of Rome. It is easy to break one stick, but very hard if it's the bundle of the sticks. He believed in the collective thinking rather than individual desires. Some of the common characteristics of the fascism are absolute power of state, ruled by a dictator, corporatism, extreme nationalism, superiority of nations' people, materialism, and imperialism. When Mussolini came home after serving in the Italian military during World War I, he felt he needed to unify the Italian people. He joined the Italian Socialist Party but was expelled later on because of his pro-war stance. So he began to adopt more nationalist and militarist views. In 1919, Mussolini organized his fascist movement in the northern city of Milan. He formed squads of street fighters who wore black shirts. His black shirts beat up socialists and communists and threw them out of the local government. But it was 1921, Mussolini officially formed the National Fascist Party. But he still lacked a clear fascist program. He only knew one thing for sure, that he wanted to rule Italy. In a speech before thousands of his supporters in October 1922, Mussolini declared, "Either the government will be given to us or we will seize it by marching on Rome." A few days later, he unleashed his followers on a massive march to Italy's capital city. As tens of thousands converged on Rome, government leaders became so unnerved that they resigned. When Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy in 1922, he appointed his education minister as individual named Giovanni Gentile, a famous Italian philosopher also known as philosopher of the Fascism, who inspired Mussolini. Gentile was instrumental in writing The Doctrine of Fascism, published in 1932. He emphasized the importance of the state and collective identity over individualism. He argued that the common will of the people should take precedence over personal desires, which aligned closely with fascist principles that prioritized national unity and strength over individual rights. Later, Mussolini put it this way: "Far from crushing the individual, the fascist state multiplies his energies, just as in a regiment a soldier is multiplied by the number of his fellow soldiers." Giovanni implemented significant reforms in the education system. His reforms were designed to cultivate a new elite aligned with the fascist ideals, reinforcing the regime's values among future generations. Building on the ideas of early European philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Gentile claimed that the peoples of the world are engaged in a survival of the fittest. He declared it is the natural right of the stronger to conquer and rule the weaker. Gentile stated that the war has another function in the fascist state. It unites the people and proves their superiority as a nation. Giovanni was convinced that he could combine philosophy with raw power. He once praised Mussolini as being dedicated to Italy in its honor, its glory, its security and prosperity, and therefore in its power and its value in the history of the world. In 1925, Mussolini declared himself a dictator and started dismantling democratic institutions. He had adopted the title Seconduce, which means the leader. He delivered emotional public speeches, swaying back and forth, puffing his chest and holding his hands on his hips. The crowds chanted back fascist slogans such as "To duce is always the right" and "Believe, obey, fight." Then in 1926, political opposition was banned and Mussolini passed laws that allow him to rule by decree. Political parties were dissolved and Italy became a one-party state. Mussolini had little use for religion. Italy, however, was a strongly Catholic country. Gentile, as Minister of Education, continued the teaching of Catholic doctrine in the elementary schools, but he replaced it with the philosophy at the secondary level. The Catholic Church objected to this reform. Hoping to keep the church from opposing his fascist regime, Mussolini adopted pro-Catholic policies against abortion and divorce. Then in 1929, he signed a treaty with the church called the Lateran Treaty, recognizing the independence of Vatican City and made Catholicism the state religion. This agreement also restored the teaching of Catholic doctrine in secondary schools. For its part, the church accepted Mussolini's fascist state and ended its involvement in Italy's political affairs. Mussolini wanted to create an economic system that provided a third way between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism depends on private property, employer-owned competing enterprises, and the profit motive. Socialism envisions a society in which the workers jointly own the economic means of production like factories, farms, etc., and control the government. Communism is a form of socialism that calls for a revolution to destroy capitalism, establish a dictatorship in the name of the workers, and distribute economic production to each according to his needs. During the 1930s, Mussolini organized industry, agriculture, and economic services into state-controlled labor unions and employer associations called corporations. Government officials appointed the heads of each union and employer corporation. They negotiated wages and working conditions with each other. The third way, corporatism attempted to unify workers and employers by requiring them to set aside their private interests in favor of the best interests of the fascist state. In practice, however, the employers usually benefited more than the workers did. Mussolini glorified military values like physical strength, discipline, obedience, and courage. He once said, "A minute of battlefield is worth a lifetime of peace." Although fascist regimes were always against the capitalism, they only criticized its materialism and not their exploitation of the working class. They denounced the bourgeoisie. It was for being too flabby and individualistic to make a nation strong. More deeply, fascists rejected the notion that economic forces are the prime movers of history. For fascists, the dysfunctional capitalism or the interwar period did not need fundamental reordering. Its ills could be cured simply by applying sufficient political will to the creation of full employment and productivity. Once in power, fascist regimes confiscated property only from political opponents or the foreigners. The regime reconfigured the relations between the individual and collectivity, so that an individual had no right outside of the community interest. Now, whether fascists were modernist or anti-modernist, scholars have different opinions about them. They were not in the favor of the faceless cities and materialist secularism, yet they adored their fast cars and planes. Fascism was staunchly anti-communist and anti-socialist, viewing these ideologies as threats to the social order. Mussolini believed that the fascism would protect Italy from the spread of communism and the rise of the working class revolution the Marxists were advocating. Political parties, labor unions, and civil society organizations were either suppressed or incorporated into the fascist state. Mussolini took control of the press, implemented censorship, and established a secret police force called the Avra to monitor and suppress dissent. Despite the aim of creating a self-sufficient economy, the Italian economy remained largely dependent on the foreign trade, and the fascist economy policies were often inconsistent. And when people started calling the regime a totalitarian state, fascists were actually happy and proud of it. That is how they mentioned it in the fascist doctrine. The rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. And if liberty is to the attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state is synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. Mussolini sought to expand Italy's influence through military campaigns, most notably in Ethiopia from 1935 to 1936 and Albania in 1939. His dream of recreating a Roman Empire was evident in his foreign policy, as Italy pursued territorial expansion. In the late 1930s, Mussolini's relationship with the Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany became increasingly important. While Mussolini initially resisted aligning fully with Hitler, Italy and Germany signed the Pact of Steel in 1939, cementing the two countries' alliance. This relationship would lead Italy into World War II. As Italy entered World War II in 1940, the country faced significant military setbacks. Mussolini's forces were defeated in Greece and North Africa. The Italian population became disillusioned with Mussolini's leadership as Italy struggled against the Allies. In 1943, Mussolini was overthrown and arrested by the king, and Italian fascist government collapsed. Mussolini was rescued by German forces and established by Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, a puppet state under Nazi control. However, this was a short-lived regime, and Mussolini's power was greatly diminished. As the war neared its end, Mussolini was attempting to flee to Switzerland, hoping to escape capture by the advancing Allied forces. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and his mistress were executed by Italian partisan. Partisan group was often aligned with the communist, socialist, and anti-fascist groups. The fall of fascism in Italy marked the end of Mussolini's reign, but the ideological and political legacy of fascism continued to influence Italy and Europe. After World War II, the Italian Fascist Party was banned and Italy became a republic. The legacy of Mussolini's regime is still a subject of debate and controversy, with some groups attempting to revive fascist ideologies while others view the period as a dark chapter in Italy's history. Fascism in Italy also served as a model for similar movements in Europe, including the Nazis in Germany, though there were important differences between Italian fascism and German National Socialism. German fascism or Nazism emerged in 1920s and 1940s. It was distinct from Italian fascism but shared key elements such as extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, and militarism. The movement culminated in the rise of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party (NSDAP), which led to the establishment of the Third Reich and ultimately triggered World War II. While Nazism is a form of fascism, it is distinguished by its specific focus on racial ideology and anti-Semitism. Both ideologies share characteristics such as authoritarian governance, militaristic nationalism, and hostility towards liberal democracy. However, fascism can be broader in its scope, encompassing various movements across Europe that did not necessarily emphasize race as heavily as Nazism did. Fascist regimes often sought to create a unified national identity through cultural homogeneity, but did not always adopt the same extreme racial policies as the Nazis. Fascism does not prioritize race, focuses on nationalism and state power, while Nazism centers on the racial superiority, specifically the Aryan race, promoting anti-Semitism and national purity. Fascism preserves class distinctions, accepts social mobility, and Nazism rejects class-based society, seeks racial unification over class divisions. Fascism is totalitarian but allows for some degree of social hierarchy. On the other hand, Nazism is totalitarian with an emphasis on absolute control over all aspects of life, justified by a racial ideology. Fascism is based on corporatism, emphasizing collective national identity without a strong racial component. And Nazism is rooted in social Darwinism and pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy, promoting a homogeneous society based on race. The roots of German fascism can be traced to the aftermath of World War I and the collapse of German Empire. The Nazi philosophy was not only a political platform, but also a worldview that sought to radically transform German society culture, and governance. A foundational concept of Nazi ideology was extreme nationalism, the idea that the German nation was superior to other nations. Nazis believed that Germany was destined for greatness and that its people were the core of a racial superior nation, which they termed the Volk, or the people. The term Volksgemeinschaft described a society in which the interests of individuals were subordinated to the needs of the nation. People were to work for the collective good, and everyone was expected to contribute to the welfare and strength of the state. The vision sought to erase class divisions and promote solidarity among Germans who were racially Aryan, while excluding and persecuting those considered undesirable, such as Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, and communists. The Nazis promoted German ethnic identity and believed that the Aryan race, specifically ethnic Germans, was superior to all other races, especially Jews and Slavs. The concept of racial purity was central to Nazi thought and drove much of their social and political policies. One of the most defining and destructive aspects of Nazi ideology was its racial theory, which posited that human beings were divided into a strict racial hierarchy. The Nazi regime used pseudoscientific ideas of race to justify its policies of oppression, exclusion, and extermination. Hitler and the Nazis considered Jews to be the ultimate enemy of German people. They believed that Jews were responsible for many of the world problems, including the defeat of Germany in World War I, the spread of communism, and economic instability. Nazi anti-Semitism was not only racial but also ideological, accusing Jews of being enemies of both the German people and of humanity itself. This led to the Holocaust, the systematic genocide in which 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazi regime. Central to Nazi racial ideology was the belief that the Aryan race required more space to expand. Lebensraum was the idea that Germany needed to conquer Eastern Europe, especially Slavic lands, to provide resources and territory for the superior German people. This expansionist ideology justified the invasion of Poland, the Soviet Union, and the systematic displacement and extermination of millions of people, including Jews, Slavs, and Romani. Nazis believed in social Darwinism, the application of Darwin's theory of evolution to human societies. They thought that the society was a battleground for the survival of the fittest, that the racially pure Germans must survive and dominate. This led to the promotion of eugenics, which involved selective breeding to promote desirable traits and the sterilization or killing of those deemed undesirable or genetically inferior, for example, the disabled, mentally ill, and ethnic minorities. They also rejected a democracy and embraced totalitarianism, a system where the state controls all aspects of public and private life. The Nazis believed in the absolute leadership of single, all-powerful leader, the Führer, who would guide the nation with supreme authority. This was known as the Führerprinzip, or leader principle, and it was central to Nazi political philosophy. Hitler was seen as the embodiment of the will of the German people, the leader who would restore Germany to the greatness and lead it through times of crisis. In the Nazi worldview, the Führer was not only a political leader but a quasi-messianic figure, possessing absolute authority and infallibility. All power was concentrated in the Führer's hand, and he became the central figure of Nazi society, the ultimate source of decision-making. The democratic institutions were abolished, political parties were outlawed, and the rule of law was dismantled. The Reichstag fire in 1933 and the subsequent Enabling Act allowed Hitler to rule by decree, bypassing the Weimar Constitution. Political dissent was crushed by Waffen-SS, and Gestapo, the Nazi regime's secret police. Opposition leaders, socialists, communists, Jews, and anyone deemed undesirable were silenced through imprisonment, torture, and execution. The Nazis sought total control over every aspect of life in Germany, including the economy, education, culture, religion, and the family. Every institution was brought under the control of the state or reoriented to support Nazi ideals. Propaganda led by Joseph Goebbels played a critical role in this process, promoting Nazi ideology through films, radio, broadcasts, posters, and rallies. The Hitler Youth was used to indoctrinate young people into their worldview. The Nazis were anti-communist, seeing communism as a Jewish-inspired ideology that sought to destroy the social order. Communism, along with liberalism and democracy, was considered an enemy of the nation-state and racial purity. The Nazi regime targeted left-wing groups, socialists, and communists, which led to the repression and the murder of thousands of political opponents in the early years of Nazi rule. They rejected the liberal democratic ideals of Weimar Republic. They viewed democracy as weak, inefficient, and susceptible to the influence of Jews, capitalists, and Marxists. In contrast, the Nazis sought to establish a strong hierarchical society led by charismatic leader and based on military strength, racial purity, and national unity. Nazi governance was rooted in authoritarianism with no room for political pluralism or individual freedoms. Nazis highly embraced militarism, believing that the war was essential to achieve national greatness. The Nazis sought to restore Germany to its rightful place as a dominant world power by expanding its territory and conquering new lands. The Nazi regime's attitude towards religion was complex and contradictory. While the Nazis outwardly professed respect for Christianity and often used religious symbolism to gain support, their core beliefs and policies were fundamentally odd with the religious teachings, especially Christianity. The Nazis sought to use religion to consolidate their power, but they also viewed it as a potential rival to their authority. As a result, their approach to religion was pragmatic and opportunistic, aiming to align religious institutions with Nazi ideology when possible and to suppress those that resisted. The majority of Germans in 1930s were either Protestant or Catholics, and the Nazis sought to co-opt both groups while keeping them under control. Catholicism was seen as a major institution that could potentially challenge authority due to its large following, hierarchical structure, and international reach, especially with the Pope in Rome. However, the Nazis were wary of the influence of Catholic Church. In fascism, the organic state refers to the societal structure where all the elements of the society, classes, institutions, and individuals are integrated into a cohesive whole. The state is seen as an embodiment of the nation where various social classes work together or come together for the common good. In Nazism, the organic state is interpreted through a racial lens, emphasizing that the state exists primarily to serve, advance the interest of the Aryan race. This ideology posits that the state should reflect and perpetuate racial hierarchies. The Nazi era lasted from 1933 to 1945. The whole period profoundly impacted Germany and Europe, marked by aggressive expansionism, systematic racism, and the implementation of genocidal policies. By 1944, Allied forces had begun to reclaim territory lost to Germany. The failure of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union marked a turning point in the war. As Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, Hitler's leadership faltered. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops encircled Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Allied headquarters in Reims, which took effect on May 8th, celebrated as the victory in Europe, or as also known as the D-Day. The legacy of the Nazi era is one of profound tragedy and moral reckoning. It serves as a stark reminder of dangers posed by totalitarianism, unchecked power, and systematic hatred. Understanding this period is crucial for preventing similar ideologies from taking root in contemporary society. The consequences of fascist regimes were catastrophic. Millions lost their lives in wars fueled by expansionist ambitions and genocidal policies. The Holocaust stands as the stark reminder of the horrors that can arise when hatred and intolerance are allowed to flourish unchecked. But fascism is not just a relic of the past. Today we see echoes of these ideologies in various forms around the world, whether it is through the authoritarian governance, xenophobia, or the rise of far-right movements. It is crucial that we remain vigilant. Understanding the roots and the characteristics of the fascism can help us recognize its sign in contemporary society. While we cannot change the past, we can learn from it by understanding the dangers of fascism and remaining committed to democratic values. We can work towards a future where such ideologies have no place. Let's strive for a world that celebrates diversity rather than division, a world where every individual is valued regardless of their background.